Hi, everyone. It is Shaman Vizzi with the Adoptive and Foster Family Coalition of New York's interview series. Today, I'll be interviewing Lisa Maynard. Let's find out what she had to say and how she supports the coalition, adoptive families, and foster families throughout New York State.
Thanks for having me. I'm really thrilled to be part of the coalition and part of this interview series that you're doing. So, yep, I'm Lisa Maynard. I am a therapist and I'm in private practice in Rochester, Monroe County area. Doing most of this virtually during the pandemic, but that's my side gig, I would say. I'm an implementation specialist for the Center for Adoption Support and Education, which is based in Maryland, and we've developed and created and have piloted and are launching nationally a web-based training for child welfare professionals and mental health professionals nationwide. And I think we could talk a little bit about more about that if you like. Um, I also do adoption home studies. I do pre-adoption consultation. Um, my private practice specialty is in trauma, and primarily women who have experienced trauma at some point in their life and are going through some kind of transition. Um, so, yeah, wearing a couple of different hats in my work.
What brought you to the coalition? How did you connect?
Yep. So, gosh, feels like a million years ago, many years ago. I'm an adoptive mom. I have two children who were both born in South Korea. My son is going to be 33 somehow, and my daughter's 31. Wow, is he going to be 34? He might even be going on 34, which is crazy. Um, but anyways, I was the founder of a parent group when my son was about, gosh, I want to say he was maybe 4 years old or something like that. And with a friend and business partner, Cindy Fleischer, we created the Adoption Resource Network. And it was for adoptees, adoptive parents, and birth parents, and trying to bring the triad together and have conversations that at the time just wasn't happening. And so we started Adoption Resource Network with the help of a $1,000 grant from the coalition. So how
That's
cool is that,
cool. Oh,
right?
wow.
So that brought us, we found the coalition, we had become members and had gone to one conference way back, gosh, I want to say maybe 1990. Um, yeah, 1991. I mean, it was, like I said,
Wow.
forever ago. And with that grant, we were able to start Adoption Resource Network and then right away got very involved with the coalition. Judith Ashton was the director at the time. Um, she was a great support to us in terms of building uh, our organization. The conferences were fabulous. We got so much information from them, made a lot of connections. I've been a fan ever since.
Wow, that's a lot. That's wonderful. That's
Yeah.
why parent groups are so important. And it takes just one person to go for it. Oh, and $1,000.
$1,000 and a great partner. Cindy and I were great partners. We worked in our basements. We were both fortunate enough to be at the time stay-at-home moms, raising our kids, and the outreach was great. The need was huge, and we were able to do a lot in the community. And then in the past, I don't know, I'm not even sure how long. I've been a member of the coalition board, and I'm now on the advisory board and in several committees.
So I actually did some research and looked at the archives of the past conferences. And I noticed that there was one in 2017 where you did a workshop on, let me say this right, treading water is harder than it seems. Would you explain a little bit to the community out there? What exactly were you focusing on that workshop?
Um, yeah. I often hear from people, typically outside of the adoption arena, who say, those families just don't get enough training. That's why the kids have problems. Um, that's why kids don't stand. There's that lack of permanence. the families can't handle it because they didn't get adequate training. And I worked at Hillside Children's Center for about 12 years and did foster and adoptive parent training. And, the training is pretty intense and pretty comprehensive. And my belief is that you can't train people for something that they don't really actually, they're not experiencing, right? So the foster and adoptive parenting typically takes place, I don't know, at least 6 to 9 months ahead of time, and usually at least a year. It's usually more like a year or two prior to there's an actual placement. And that is for any type of adoption, whether it's through foster care, international, or an infant adoption. There's a time gap between the training and actually doing the parenting, right? And so I was thinking about what can I compare this to? And so I thought about treading water and how, if you ever took swimming lessons, one of the first things you do, and I remember this from being a little kid, right? One of the first things you do is you learn how to tread water so you can stay afloat if you get into trouble. And so I thought, okay, treading water, and I think my memory is you had to do it for a certain number of minutes. Like you had to be competent, right? And so then I started thinking about what would happen if I know how to tread water. I've done it in practice, right? I've learned how to do it. Now, what if I'm on a cruise ship and the cruise ship sinks and I'm in the middle of the ocean? How well would I be able to tread water? Right? Well, first of all, I'm pretty sure I would panic. Like sharks and stuff, right? And then the waves are huge. It's so much different than being in a pool and practicing. And so those waves are washing over you. And how do you keep breathing and not drown, right? And so the workshop was basically now that you actually have a child in your care, now that you're parenting for real, what does this feel like? And how do you keep your head above water?
That's amazing. That's amazing what you're saying, because I'm literally, as I'm sitting here thinking about what I did as a kid and those lessons where I did tread the water, but the final, I don't know, test was they took you to the diving board and no joke, literally dropped you off.
Oh, really?
And my husband did it too. So it was a YMCA, go to the end and literally drop you. Even though you knew you could tread, the fear of jumping in because you have to sink, get back up, and figure out what you're doing. And I'm like literally seeing that in my head going, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, right? It's a great metaphor, I think.
It is. I like that.
Yeah. So how do we support families who think who've gotten the training and they think, yeah, I've got this. Maybe babysat as kids, right? I know how to handle kids. I've got nieces and nephews, right?
That didn't work for me.
Yeah, well, then you get a placement. You bring a child into your home through adoption or foster care, and they've got their trauma history, and they've got their multiple moves where things have been different in different households, and you're like, holy cow, I'm drowning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That makes so much sense. Oh, no, I wish I look back at all these, the topics that and I hope that maybe it circles around a little bit for some people like me, who my first conference was 2018. So I didn't any of these. So I actually like doing these interviews. So I get to learn a little bit because I would have never learned that metaphor before. Now let's move to 2018. Where I see, now this is a long one, but it's actually a very important one because I noticed that this is something that we deal with all the time, is supporting permanency through improved adoption competent mental health services. Or basically what I was thinking of is you're trying to help find adoption competent professionals, or that it's hard to find. Why did you feel that this was something important for everybody to learn at a workshop?
Right. So, well, because
no, I know, but we're
partly from my experience over the years of working with adoptive families, and the number of people that by the time they got to me had worked with a couple of different therapists or mental health providers, maybe in a residential setting or a partial treatment kind of center setting, and they come in and say, I've had all all these people, nobody ever talked to me about adoption. Nobody ever talked to my child about adoption. And in fact, it got so rough for us that the therapist actually said, this really isn't what you got into adoption for. Maybe you should give the child back. And happened over and over and over and over. And as recently as like within the last couple of years, people are still coming and saying, this is what the therapist told me. What do you think? Like, well, first of all, we don't give children back, right? It's not a piece of clothing or something you order on Amazon that you need to return,
No.
because you don't like how it fits, right?
Right.
So that's unacceptable. And there are a lot of therapists who just don't understand that when you talk about trauma or loss and grief is very different for a child who comes into a family through trauma history and losing everybody that they knew in their life, right? Even if they were not treated the best in those families. And so that loss and grief is very different. And there's just not enough understanding about that in the professional world. And so my day job is working, as I said, with the Center for Adoption Support and Education on a project called the National Adoption Competency Mental Health Training Initiative.
Okay. That's
yeah, right. That's a mouthful. We call it NTI.
Okay.
And this is the web-based, self-paced training that we've developed through a cooperative agreement with the Children's Bureau. It's a 20-hour training for child welfare professionals and a 30-hour training for mental health professionals. Very well aligned curricula. The mental health professional training has a more clinical focus, but really trying to create a shared language and a deeper understanding and knowledge of adoption and the core issues of adoption, and then providing skills and tools to do the work. And so I love this training. I've been working with the Center for Adoption Support and Education now for almost 5 years. It's really, 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 really good. Again, it's web-based, so it's all online. It's self-paced. You do it at your own pace, and it's free. The best thing of all is it's free, free for adoption, for mental health professionals, and for child welfare professionals. So it's not designed for parents, but there are just a myriad of tools that are built in that a therapist or mental health professional or child welfare professional can take and immediately, walk out the door and give the resources to the adoptive families and foster families.
Yeah, I found that over the years as I've been learning through this, especially intensely since 2018, that something is simple, I hate to downplay it, that my trauma really, truly, it makes simple sense. I mean, well, my trauma obviously is going to impact how I parent. But when you've got trauma, the kids got trauma, and
Right.
everybody's just doing this, that's probably why professionals that aren't adoption competent just say, well, then it doesn't fit, give it back.
Right.
Just constantly doing this.
Right. And you're right. And you're both triggering each other, right?
Exactly. It's like this vicious circle.
Yeah.
So as the parent, you need to start. And that's why I feel like with AFFCNY, they, with even just the reframing classes and just take it a step by step and realize that there was a book, I think it was The Connected Child, where the first time I ever heard ground yourself. Now, this was years ago. I mean, this is very simplistic stuff when you're first starting off, but for someone who doesn't know how to focus on looking back at themselves or internally about what they've been through, grounding yourself is not a simple thing, kind of like what you stated before.
Right.
Like I jumped off the diving board and I went, oh my goodness, I have to ground before acting. I'm like, I've never done that before. I've never stopped to think about what I was doing. I was just trying to tread water.
and you wind up doing this, right?
Exactly.
So
no, that makes a ton of sense. This is amazing. Then now let's go to 2019. you did two workshops. Now you
I
have
did.
two more topics that you were talking about. One about managing micro transitions, which is kind of where we're leading on how I guess it was almost like a buildup for you, like you one step at a time for everybody. And then the other one, which I loved, was all in the family. Why don't you give a little bit about both of those and why you felt those were now important?
So micro transitions has to do with all the changes that happen when a child moves from one place to another, right? So, if I think about my kids who were born in South Korea, they went from their birth mother when they were born, and we don't know how much time they spent with their birth mothers, probably not much, to a foster home, to a 28-hour plane ride with a stranger because the escorts are strangers. At the time anyway. I'm not sure if the parents are having to travel right now to. I don't even know if Korea is doing adoption at the moment, but to a stranger, getting off the plane after that 28 hours that didn't, by the way, include the travel from the orphanage to, or I mean, all these transitions, right? To being plopped in our lap at an airport. I mean, literally, right? Just boom. And all the things that have changed for that child, the number of times that the baby moved, the sights are different, the sounds, right? The language, um, most likely had never been in an airport or a crowded area before. The smell of our skin and our bodies, just because our diet is different. So depending on what your diet is, your skin smells different. Instead of faces that are, pretty similar. I mean, when you're in a homogeneous society, like someplace like Korea, Japan, Vietnam, right? Everybody sort of looks very similar. You've got the very fair skin, you've got very dark hair, you've got very dark eyes. And, my babies came home to, I was actually blonde at the time. Um, and a big loud Italian family, and their dad's side a big loud Irish family. So all these changes, and every one of those is a micro transition. For our kids who are coming into our families through foster care, how many transitions have they made over the years? Not only from family to family, house to house. The rules are different, the schools are different, the people in the home are different. Are there, other kids in the house? Are there no other kids? So every one of those transitions is a shock to the system. It's like, and you're trying to figure it all out, right? As a child. And it really just sort of, it upsets the brain. It shocks the brain. It shocks the nervous system.
I think many of people don't realize, especially when they're adoptive parents to infants, many of them, and I've interviewed so many people where it's just, well, they're an infant, they don't remember anything.
Right, that tabula rasa,
Right.
right?
Right. But I brought my son home, and then years later, I had a biological child, and just that simple. And I hate to say simple because it's me learning as I'm going, and things that when you look at it, you go, that really makes sense. Why didn't I think of it that way? But when my youngest was crying, and I put him on the bed and he fell asleep because he was laying on my t-shirt,
Right.
because no one's never really explained it or never heard it, how would I know? I didn't know about that my smell was something, my sound was something. And again, makes perfect sense now. And you kind of slap yourself upside the head like, well, you know what? You didn't know, now you know. You
Yeah,
didn't.
I mean, we don't know what we don't know, right?
Exactly, exactly. And it was hard. I was like, that makes a ton of sense. I'm wondering why he kept falling asleep so fast on my shirt, but very
Yeah,
different. So it makes perfect sense. And that's just a tiny little thing. So micro, like what you're saying,
right.
but
Teeny
it's
tiny.
huge in the grand scheme of their journey of life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I hear that from adoptive parents, newborn adoption. It's like, what? Well, they didn't know their mother, except, well, hello, they grew in their mother,
Mhm.
right? For 9 months, hearing voices, knowing sensations, again, tastes. I mean, they're not tasting, but you know, the food we eat.
Yeah, well, it makes a big difference. There's a lot of birth families that you eat something that you're craving now. The kid, like, there's connections throughout the whole thing.
Right.
So, right. Well, is that why you ended up going to the next one and doing birth families at the same time? See
Well,
how
yeah, yeah.
you're leading it along.
There's a trajectory here.
Yeah,
Um, well, in the birth families connections, what do we call it? All in the family, right?
right.
So, so oftentimes people, I'll speak for myself. I didn't want to have a birth family connection when I adopted my kids. It was, very, very honestly, one of the reasons I went to Korea. The parental rights were terminated. There was no contact. There was no, you got your, spreadsheet of information, and there was no turning back. There was no, I wonder if this birth mom is going to go through with it, right? Um, as an infant adoption, when the birth mother has a period of time in which she can change her mind, which I believe is really, appropriate and it makes sense. So I was just going to be mom. I just wanted to be mom. That's all I wanted, was to be a mom. And so if that was out of the way, I didn't have to worry about birth family at all. And it was literally the day I first held my son that I said, I'm your mommy. And it hit me in the head. It's like, oh my gosh, I didn't give birth to this child. He has another mommy. And it was like, wow, it was so profound for me. And so the importance of birth family connection, and I've learned more over the years, obviously, in almost 34 years, but how profound that connection is and how important it is to honor that and bring that into our family to the extent possible is so important. So trying to negotiate those relationships in open adoption, which I'm a huge advocate of now. Again, when I was looking at it, it would have terrified me. It wasn't really that big of a thing at the time, but it would have terrified me. Have some other mom in my children's life, forget about it. But now I'm like, find it so extremely valuable. So how do you manage those relationships?
Amazing.
Right? But like, how do we manage any
I
relationship?
know.
You know, you
Right.
can think about your spouse or your partner. You can think about
We can
relationships.
even think about it. I use the word simple, but I always think of it as a divorced family, or for people who are not in the adoption journey, you can kind of equate it to like, okay, so you have you're separated, maybe you got remarried, so now you have
Right,
double that, so now there's more, and
right.
how do you manage that? And
All these families. Yeah,
layer, everyone's got some kind of layer, but they're always thinking that adoption is so different than it's not really different. It's a managing of your journey of layers, intertwining different people, and
right. It's like getting married, right? So you get married and you bring in your spouse's family into your family, your in-laws.
right.
And some of us are blessed to have really wonderful in-laws, and some people are not so lucky, right?
Right, right,
It's true. There's stuff like in everybody's life. And
right.
so even if you're not so lucky to have wonderful in-laws, you pretty much usually have to incorporate them into your family and figure out how to be in the same room with them, whether it's holidays or weddings or funerals or whatever. You're going to have to be interacting in some way. And so you don't have to fall in love with your in-laws. You don't have to fall in love with your child's birth parents, but are there ways to negotiate those relationships so that the value that they can bring to your child, knowing their history, knowing, their culture, knowing where they came from, thinking about, your great great grandfather did thus and such, right? I mean, it's a whole line of people behind every one of us. And so how do we maintain those connections in a safe way, for our kids who come from not so safe places, right? But there's still ways to do it. And so that's sort of what that was about.
I like to ask this on to everyone I interview, and this is just from your personal growth and journey through your life of adoption, foster care. Do you have any books that you feel are important that you'd put out there and say, you know, I really like this one in my opinion, of what kind of books you liked as you went through it that taught you something?
So I've got a few books that I always recommend to people at any point in their adoption. Um, The Family of Adoption by Dr. Joyce McGuire Pavo is one of my favorites. And Beneath the Mask by Debbie Riley. Those two are super accessible. Um, Really, really easy reading. Lots of great pointers in there. A lot of sort of like looking at the psychology of adoption. Dr. David Brzezinski wrote a book called The Psychology of Adoption, which is really good, but it's a lot more clinically focused and a lot. It's just it's not an easy read. It's more like a textbook. It feels to me. Great, great stuff in there. It's but as I said, the other two are more accessible, I think. The Primal Wound is a really hard.
That's a hard, you have to kind of put it down every now and then. I know a lot of people read it a little bit and then take a pause and then come back.
Right.
But it's amazing, but
yeah, a really hard book to read. But and when I first read it, it made me very angry, I will say, because I didn't want to believe it. And all these years later, it's like, oh yeah, she knew what she was talking about.
right.
Yeah. And then I love Jean Strauss's book Beneath the Tall Tree. So she talks about being an adopted person, and she's got some fabulous videos that are free online as well. And I think it's Strauss, Jean Strauss. But talking about the adoptee's perspective and what it feels like in search and reunion and all the complicated emotions that go along with that.
Okay. So
Yeah.
my last question, if you could tell the community right now why they needed to attend an AFFCNY conference, what would you say was the most important reason why, or a couple of reasons why you feel it's important to attend these conferences each year?
They're fabulous.
There we go. We're
Fabulous.
done. We got our soundbite.
It's one of a kind in New York State, and the connections are invaluable. Hearing from other families, right? So if you're an adoptive parent and you've got experiences, having that connection and listening to other people's stories to say, oh my gosh, I've had this experience. I'm not all alone in the world. I think that is one of the best parts of the conference. The other is the knowledge that gets shared by experts. And by experts, I mean people who have worked in adoption over time and people who have lived adoption, whether birth families, adopted people, sharing their experience and their knowledge and resources and tools in all of the workshops. That is invaluable to be able to learn from people who have been there, done that. So, for you and I, this is not some theoretical, right? Oh yeah, I read a book about adoption in my social work training, and so now I know about it. This is like, no, we have lived this experience, so we understand it in a different way. And I think that is just invaluable. It's a great resource across New York State. There's just so much to offer. I'm a fan.